Thank you very much. Greetings from Berlin. I'm living in Germany. I'm technically Danish, and I would very much have liked to be there today. I'm sorry, something came up. One of our biggest potential customers called us and needed a meeting urgently to sign a contract, and I had to do it. So, but next time I will be happy to be there in person. We at Trax, we make CO2 measurement systems. We do carbon visibility. And we do it of the reason that many of you have experienced already. It has become the norm. Many companies insist on having an end-to-end CO2 emission protocol for everything that has happened in the logistic and in the transport. And it's very, very difficult for companies to do. It has become much more intensive since March, where the SFDR came out. For those who don't know it, it's a sustainable finance disclosure regulation. Not many people know exactly. I mean, it was snuck in a little bit because people thought it has nothing to do with me. It's about if you have an investment fund and you call yourself green, you need to prove that you're green. But it means a lot to almost everyone, because it means if someone invests on the stock exchange and they want to call themselves green, then every company they want to invest in needs to prove that they're green. And that happens through the thing that you make a CO2 emission calculation, and it has to be audited. And then you make a plan of how you lower CO2. So since March this year, we have experienced that almost every single company on the stock exchange in Europe has started dramatically looking for making precise and audited carbon emission calculations. And what does it have to do with you guys? Yeah, with the logistics industry. It has a lot to do with the logistic industry, because the people have to measure the CO2 all the way in their supply chain, both upstream and downstream, and upstream all the way to the mine or to the field or to the forest or wherever they have their primary. So a lot of companies are now being asked, please make CO2 emission management. That's not easy. Everyone who knows the market for transport visibility knows that just getting the data translated for the shipper to the carrier is extremely difficult. And with CO2 emission management, it's even more difficult because, yeah, we have often very small companies. In Lithuania, not so much, also big companies. They have to find out not just what did the trucks spend on the road, for instance, on a trip, how much CO2, how much fuel, then they have to allocate to every single shipment that was on board. And again, accounting proof after a very, very certain calculation, the empty trips have to be allocated on every single shipment. So that is very, very complex. I'm just going to tell just a little bit of a scope 1, 2, and 3, what that all means. CO2 emission management is new for many people. Scope 1 is every single gram of CO2 that happens through your direct operations as a company. And now I'm talking about shippers, real shippers, retailers, producers. That are the electricity that happened when you're in the factory. That's how the diesel you spend on the company vehicles. Scope 2 is electricity and heat. So it's also, it's both scope 1 and scope 2 is how much coal did you spend to create these things. But scope 3, that's where it becomes very interesting and extremely difficult. That is, you need to measure all the CO2 that happened indirectly, both upstream and downstream. And we see, like, it's not just transport, as I said, it's all the way down to the mine. It is waste, it's investments, it's really, really complex. And we cannot ignore it. So again, a big retailer or a big producer will have to see scope 1 and 2 will be around about 10% of the CO2 emissions. So if they want to follow what their investors are insisting of them, that they want to be CO2 neutral by 2050, they need to find out how can they first measure and then manage the CO2 in their scope 3. And that's why everyone is getting a phone call at the moment from their customers saying, I need a clear and audit-proof measurement of CO2 in my transport chain. But now I just want to talk a little bit about how can you do it? How do we deal with the data qualities? There is one big standard out there in the world. It's called GLEC. I'll come to in a second what it means. And it allows 5 different qualities of data management or data allocation. It can all be accredited. It's just about how precise is the data. So it starts with the default. That is, if we know absolutely nothing about which vehicle has transported the goods. So we know everything about the shipment, the ton kilometers, but we don't know nothing about who transported it. There we have always, as calculators of CO2, always take for granted that it was the worst case. So if it's 1 ton on a pallet that goes from A to B, we have to take for granted it was on a 3.5 ton truck or a van going through the city and empty home. The next step is model data. It is where we know something. If we know that it's a 40-ton truck, we are allowed to say it has not 350 grams CO2 per ton kilometer, which would be with the van. It has 100 grams. So instead of 350, it's 100 grams of CO2 per ton kilometer. If it's, we can sort of like calculate there. There's another granularity that goes to it, but it's still average numbers. If we know that it's an EU6 engine, we have official statistics that say it's 92 grams of CO2 per ton kilometer. But where it gets very exciting is when we start using primary data and really get the primary data from the vehicle and allocate the trips, as I said before, and the empty runs to the different shipments on board. There we often go down to round about 56, 60 grams of CO2 per ton kilometer. So the companies who measure like this, they get a much lower CO2 pressure to offset or to minimize. This is what we call carbon visibility. And this is where we work together with different partners among TMS providers. One very, very big transport visibility provider is our partner. So we are working together with the enterprise landscape to make sure that both shippers and carriers and somewhere in the middle, the LSPs are able to build up this infrastructure to measure CO2. A short word to the GLEC framework. That is the standard per se on measuring CO2. It is the definition that is going into the ISO standard that comes out in November 22. And it has been designed this way that if we don't know anything about who has transported, we have to take for granted that it's very, very negative. And we see the better and more granular data we get, the lower number of CO2 we need to measure. Here you see the over calculation modes that we have on them. If you use default data, you're 400% wrong. And if you start modeling, you can get to around 40%. And if you use the absolute data, you get to a 0% calculation. So it's not just about over calculating. It's also about finding out what do you do with the data. So if you only measure ton and kilometer and mode, your only decision-making tool to lower CO2, because we don't just want to measure, we also want to lower CO2. The only measures you can do to lower CO2 is change your mode, because no one wants to drive less. Yeah, no one wants to. Yeah. So you change mode. And I've seen this a couple of times with some very big shippers who go out and say, we have a strategy, stop going on the airplane, and then just have a modal shift from truck to train or ship. And that's all nice, but everyone who knows anything about logistics know that, especially if you go through Germany, the rails are full, they're overpriced, and it's just not happening. So what other people do with the model data, they have other factors, and that gives then other levers to lower. So we see we have the opportunity again to do intermodality, which is an important factor, but you need the data in order to make decisions, not just say, stop flying. Yeah, you can stop flying, but get everything on the railroad. Doesn't work. But you also have the opportunity, if you start measuring CO2 depending on, or modeling CO2 depending on which engine you're driving, you also have the opportunity to set the fleet of your subcontractor and help him have a better fleet, electric vehicles, or get the fill rate up, and so on and so forth. This is what we have seen out there. This is what the model data can help. But if you work with primary data, which Track is offering, you also have a lot of other opportunities. As I said, collective strategies, collaborative strategies as finding out which kind of driver courses can I help my subcontractor to drive, what will be the return of investment, because we have the data and we are able to calculate where can you most efficiently help your subcontractor to lower CO2, tie your subcontractor in by helping him lease an electric vehicle and make sure that the CO2 lowers by that. Partner management, an important topic. Right now, not so relevant because it's difficult to find any partner who can find any truck. But it is a possibility to also go in and say, okay, you're too dirty, so to speak. We need to drive with someone else. Supply chain strategy is a big topic for us. That's why we work with TMS providers, because TMS providers will get this API and then use it with their customers to set up new decision-making tools for their procurement. And then, of course, there are the new business models that are coming in and that we're discussing with several customers. This is how it looks when you drive with trucks. You start having an enormously high measured CO2. Now, this is from a shipper perspective, where the shipper has gotten many of his subcontractors to send him the primary data. The first thing that happened was that we lowered the measured CO2 right away with an enormous amount. And the rest of the CO2, we're sitting down right now and making strategies how to reduce the CO2 so that the amount of CO2 that needs to be offsetted is going to be minimal. This is fantastic, especially when you come to a point of time where the price of 1 ton of offsetted CO2 is round about 67 euros, and it is rising rapidly. So it makes a lot of sense. The return of investment is immediate with us. So this is what we do. We simplify the streamlining. We create a data as a service. We don't really need to have a user interface in your products and in your companies. It's something we do together with your integrator or with your TMS provider. And we make sure that the exchange is simple. We don't use hardware for the trucks. We use the existing telematics systems. And we are the only ones in the world who can provide an automated, accredited, and precise measurement of CO2 already from tomorrow. So what we can only advise people is start today, get as many trucks on board as you can, and then slowly get more and more of your external subcontractors or your own trucks, if you have them yourself, on board, so that you can really go to the primary data. And then continue cooperation with your carriers, get those externalities in, that you get a better connection to your best carriers, give them some electric vehicles, put your brand on the side, depending on which kind of company you have, and make sure that we get to the point where we're ready for the enormous price of carbon that is coming in at the moment. So this is Trax. I'm also ready for question and answers. And I'll be happy to get in contact with you guys and also be there next year in person.
Jakob, thank you very much. Incredibly interesting presentation. Thank you. Would there be any questions from the audience? I have one from the platform regarding pricing. Is there any specific line, I don't know, turnover or income or fleet, when the company would be already in the position that your service or your model would be, worth acquiring or worth buying?
We say as a rule of thumb, if you as a shipper buy more than 12,000 shipments a year, already there, it definitely makes sense. It depends, of course. If you're only driving with your own fleet, it also makes sense to work with us. It's just much cheaper because we have another deal with people who own a truck. We want to make it easy for them. We want the rich companies at the end of the value chain to pay, and not the truck owners. I forgot to say to everyone, we do operate with all 5 modes of transport, but I love talking about trucks, especially in Lithuania, because it is simply the most difficult part of our logistic infrastructure.
That's perfect. It's great to hear that you also care of us SMEs and small owners. Thank you, Jakob.